The doctor stopped speaking halfway through the sentence. Not dramatically, not with concern. He simply paused, eyes lowering to the file in his hands, as if a word had slipped out of alignment with the page. The room did not react right away. For a moment, everything continued exactly as it had been, quiet, controlled, procedural. The nurse remained still beside the counter. The man seated next to me kept his posture relaxed, hands folded comfortably, confidence unchallenged. Then the doctor closed the folder. "I need a moment," he said evenly, already rising from his chair. No explanation followed. He did not look at me. He did not look at the man beside me either. He turned and left the room, the door closing with a soft, unremarkable click. Silence settled in slowly. It wasn't the awkward kind. It wasn't tense yet. It was the kind of silence that assumes compliance. I stayed exactly where I was, hands resting in my lap, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward. I had been instructed not to speak unless spoken to. That instruction had not been given by the doctor. It had been given long before we entered the hospital. "Just let me handle it," the man beside me had said earlier that morning. "It'll go smoother that way." He had said it kindly, calmly, with the authority of someone who had already been recognized as such. Inside the consultation room, that authority had worked instantly. He introduced himself as my authorized medical representative, not a relative, not a friend, a representative. The word carried weight without emotion, and the staff accepted it without question. From that moment on, the conversation no longer belonged to me. "She tends to get overwhelmed by technical details," he explained when the nurse glanced in my direction. "She prefers that I translate things for her," he added with a polite smile. The nurse nodded. The doctor adjusted his glasses and continued. Questions were asked, answers were provided, for me. "She's already agreed to the treatment plan. We've discussed the risks thoroughly. She trusts my judgment on these matters." Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed something else entirely, a narrative where my presence was symbolic, not necessary. I spoke once. It wasn't a protest, just a clarification. The man beside me placed his hand lightly on the armrest between us and interrupted with a gentle laugh. "What she means is—" The doctor accepted the correction without hesitation. I stopped speaking. The humiliation wasn't loud. There were no raised voices, no insults, no visible cruelty. It was administrative, polite, documented. Consent language replaced choice. Precaution replaced autonomy. Time frames were introduced, temporary restrictions they called them, during which certain decisions would be deferred, access limited, authority centralized. Weeks, possibly longer. No one used the word control. They didn't have to. The nurse slid a clipboard toward me for signatures. Her fingers lingered just long enough for me to notice the hesitation before she pulled her hand away. I noticed many things. The doctor explained the next phase, flipping through the file as he spoke. His voice remained professional, practiced, neutral. This was not his first time delivering these terms. Then his finger stopped moving. He frowned slightly, not enough to alarm anyone. He turned back a page, then another. No one else reacted yet. The man beside me leaned back in his chair, confident, intact. He had no reason to doubt the process. He had shaped it carefully. I lowered my gaze to the documents resting on my lap. My name was printed correctly. The authorization date wasn't. Neither was the scope. Weeks earlier, when the papers had first arrived at my address, I had read them in silence, not the summaries, the footnotes, the language that never made it into conversations. That was when I stopped asking questions. That was when I started copying everything. Silence wasn't weakness, it was leverage. The doctor cleared his throat. "I'm going to step out for a moment," he said, closing the folder again. "I need to verify something with administration." The man reacted too quickly. "Is there an issue?" he asked, smile tightening just slightly. "Just a routine check," the doctor replied, already standing. He left the room. This time the silence shifted. The man beside me turned toward me fully now, his voice lowering. "This isn't the time to complicate things," he said quietly. "You don't want this to escalate." Escalate. The word was meant to scare me, to suggest consequences without naming them. I looked at him for the first time since we had arrived. I said nothing. He exhales through his nose, leaned back and forced a casual chuckle. Doctors get cautious, that's all. The door opened again. The doctor returned, holding the file differently now, carefully, deliberately. He remained standing. "There's a discrepancy," he said calmly. "Until it's resolved, we won't be proceeding." The man's posture stiffened. On what basis? The doctor did not answer him. He turned to me instead. "I'll need to confirm a few details directly, independently." I nodded once. I didn't thank him. I didn't smile. This wasn't intervention. It was protocol, and protocols don't reverse themselves. As the doctor began outlining the next steps, I already knew something else. Administrative reviews leave trails, and trails, once documented, don't disappear quietly. No one ever announced that control had shifted. It happened the way systems prefer, quietly, efficiently, without asking permission. By the time the doctor returned, the room felt smaller, not physically, structurally. Conversations no longer paused for me. Decisions were no longer phrased as questions. I was still present, but no longer central. The first thing I noticed was eye contact, or the absence of it. The doctor spoke to the man beside me, lowering his voice slightly, as if professionalism required privacy from the person being discussed. The nurse followed his lead. So did everyone else. I became the only one in the room without an active role. A folder was placed on the table, thicker than before, updated. I recognized the color coding immediately. Internal use, not patient-facing. It was slid toward him, not toward me. "She can get overwhelmed," he said casually, without looking at me. "This way is easier for her." No one challenged that statement, not because it was convincing, but because it fit the structure everyone was already operating inside. I kept my hands folded in my lap. That mattered more than it looked like. Paperwork began to move faster after that. Pages turned, sections were summarized out loud, not to me, but for me. I listened carefully to what was included, and more importantly, to what was skipped. Temporary restrictions were described as precautionary. Access limitations were framed as protective. Consent boundaries were explained as already understood. Each phrase softened the reality underneath it. At one point, a nurse hesitated while reviewing a form, just a fraction of a second. Her finger paused over a line before continuing. She glanced at the doctor, then at him, then away. I noticed the date discrepancy before she did. No one asked for my signature. Instead, he signed, confidently, as if this was something he had done many times before, as if the system recognized him more clearly than it recognized me. When the nurse left, he leaned closer. His voice stayed gentle. "This will move faster if we keep things simple," he said. "Complications make people nervous." It wasn't a threat. It was instruction. Over the next few hours, pressure didn't increase, it narrowed. Requests required approval now. Information arrived filtered. When I asked a question, it was answered indirectly, often redirected through him. "She doesn't need that detail. I'll explain it to her later. She trusts me." The word trusts was used like a credential. A social worker arrived in the afternoon. She introduced herself professionally, warmly, with a practiced balance of empathy and procedure. She asked how I was feeling. She asked if I felt supported. Then she asked if I felt safe within the current arrangement. Before I could respond, he spoke. "Yes," he said, "she prefers it this way." The social worker nodded and wrote something down. I noticed where she didn't look. I noticed which box she checked. I noticed that the form never reached me. That was the moment something shifted internally, not emotionally, strategically, because I understood the pattern now. This wasn't chaos, this was delegation, and delegation always leaves a trail. As evening approached, restrictions solidified. Visiting hours were clarified with new emphasis. Requests were rerouted. Even basic updates were framed as optional disclosures. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. Gaslighting didn't arrive as denial. It arrived as reassurance. "You're tired. You're stressed. This is standard protocol." Each sentence reduced my credibility without raising suspicion. I stayed quiet. But I stopped being passive. I began tracking rhythm instead of content. Who answered first, who hesitated, which statements were repeated verbatim, and which were paraphrased. Systems repeat language when they're operating correctly and change it when they're covering gaps. One gap appeared earlier than he realized. A designation appeared on a form that didn't align with the authority he was exercising, not wrong enough to raise alarms, but inconsistent enough to matter. I saw it twice, once in print, once in behavior. That was enough. By night, he was relaxed. The system had accepted his presence. No one questioned his role anymore. He spoke about timelines like facts, about outcomes like certainties. He believed the structure was sealed. What he didn't realize was that structures don't collapse from noise. They collapse from records. Alone again, I replayed everything carefully. The phrases, the signatures, the moments where silence had been interpreted as agreement. They believed I had been managed. They were wrong, because silence inside a system like this isn't absence, it's documentation. And once documentation begins, procedures don't pause, they progress. By the third day, the system no longer felt unfamiliar. That was intentional. Once routines settle, people stop checking assumptions. They stop verifying what already feels established. Authority doesn't need to assert itself loudly when it's been accepted quietly. He understood that instinctively, which is why he stopped performing. He spoke less, signed faster, gave instructions without explanation. Staff responded to him automatically now, not because he demanded it, but because the system had already placed him in the correct mental category: responsible, involved, approved. I watched how easily it happened. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Updates were delivered to him first. Any question directed at me was gently rerouted. She doesn't need to worry about that. I'll handle it. No one meant harm. That was the most dangerous part. Control disguised as care doesn't trigger resistance. It triggers relief. I remained cooperative, predictable, calm. That consistency created something valuable: confidence in my passivity. And confidence makes systems lazy. A case coordinator joined the process on the fourth day. She was efficient, neutral, and precise. She reviewed timelines, noted compliance, and summarized progress in a way that sounded reassuring to anyone listening casually. Her questions were specific, but not deep. She asked if decisions were being made smoothly, if communication was clear, if the arrangement felt stable. He answered every one of them with practiced ease. Yes, yes, yes. She checked her boxes. What she didn't ask, and what he didn't notice, was why she didn't ask me directly, because I had already been classified, not as resistant, not as unstable, but as managed. That classification narrowed the system's attention in a very specific way. Oversight becomes lighter when outcomes appear orderly. Behind that order, details begin to slip. On the fifth day, I requested a copy of a routine document. Nothing sensitive, nothing urgent, just a standard file related to scheduling. The staff member hesitated, then said she'd need approval from him. That was new, not the restriction, but the delay. When approval came, it came quickly, almost reflexively. He didn't read the request carefully. He trusted the pattern more than the content. That file confirmed something I had already suspected. Processes had been merged that shouldn't have been. Temporary authorizations were being treated as continuous ones. Oversight layers were overlapping, creating blind spots instead of safeguards. This wasn't malicious. It was procedural drift, and drift always leaves evidence. By then, he had grown comfortable correcting people in front of me. She's confused about that. That's not necessary for her. Each time he did, his tone softened, as if concern justified authority. I noted when staff deferred without verifying, when notes were summarized instead of recorded verbatim, when verbal confirmations replaced written ones. Small efficiencies, cumulative risk. One afternoon, I overheard him explaining the situation to someone on the phone. His voice was relaxed, almost conversational. Yes, everything's under control now. That sentence stayed with me because systems don't care about control. They care about alignment, and alignment had quietly shifted. By the end of the week, the process no longer revolved around events, it revolved around assumptions. Assumptions about consent, about representation, about authority. Those assumptions were now documented, not by me, by the system itself. I spent my time listening instead of reacting, observing instead of interrupting. The more invisible I became, the more transparent everything else grew. People repeat patterns when they believe they're unseen. He began skipping explanations, signing without double-checking, speaking on my behalf without waiting for confirmation. Carelessness doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. Late that evening, a staff member referenced a designation that didn't match his actual role. She corrected herself quickly, embarrassed. He didn't notice. I did. That discrepancy had appeared again, not loud, not obvious, but consistent, which meant it wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a trail. By then, I no longer felt pressure. Pressure belongs to uncertainty. What I felt instead was timing, because once systems finalize their internal narrative, they stop defending it. They archive it, and archived decisions don't disappear. They get reviewed, silently, automatically. He believed the hardest part was over. In reality, the most dangerous phase had just stabilized. I lay awake that night not thinking about escape or confrontation, but about records, about timestamps, about how many independent departments had now touched the same assumption without verifying its origin. That's how reversals begin, not with resistance, but with consistency. And consistency, once logged, doesn't belong to anyone anymore. It belongs to the system. By the fourth week, the system had already moved on. That was the first truth I accepted, not emotionally, but structurally. Institutions don't echo emotions. They absorb silence. They normalize outcomes. They convert people into references and references into habits. What feels like injustice to one person becomes precedent to everyone else. I had become a precedent. Not because I was wrong, not because I had failed, but because no one had been required to look closely enough. Everything around me became professionally polite. Conversations were smooth, neutral, almost warm. Decisions were explained calmly, with just enough confidence to discourage questions, the kind of confidence that doesn't feel aggressive, just final. Meetings started without waiting. Documents arrived already approved. Choices were framed as conclusions, not discussions. No one asked for my agreement anymore. And that absence of resistance was misread as acceptance. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't withdrawing, I was recalibrating. I began paying attention to the system itself, not the people inside it. Systems have patterns. They reveal their weaknesses not through conflict, but through convenience. And this one had become very comfortable, too comfortable. Verification steps quietly disappeared. Written confirmations were replaced by verbal assumptions. Timelines were adjusted because everyone already knows the context. No one questioned it because nothing had collapsed yet. Careless systems don't feel dangerous while they're working. They feel efficient. I didn't interrupt. I didn't object. I didn't correct anyone publicly. I documented. The man who once guarded his authority now wore it casually. He spoke faster, decided quicker. He trusted his position to carry accuracy for him. That confidence wasn't arrogance, it was habit, and habits leave trails. The first procedural pressure didn't arrive dramatically. There was no announcement, no warning, just a routine compliance acknowledgement request, the kind that usually passes unnoticed because it's meant to, except this one didn't move forward immediately. A day passed, then another. The reply went out, confident, complete, and wrong in ways that only documentation could reveal later. I noticed the shift before anyone said anything. Email language changed. Approval chains lengthened. Certain phrases disappeared and were replaced with careful qualifiers. People began reading attachments instead of skimming them. Nothing was wrong yet, but the system had slowed itself down. That only happens when someone, somewhere, starts looking twice. During a closed-door meeting I wasn't invited to, a procedural category was quietly mentioned for the first time. Not an accusation, not an escalation, just a classification, the kind that triggers secondary review. No one reacted visibly, but the tone of authority changed. Confidence gave way to precision. Precision gave way to caution. For the first time, explanations included sources. I stayed where I was, silent, present, observant. Then I made my only move, a clarification request, brief, neutral, almost forgettable. One line referencing an earlier document that had never been formally cross-verified. No emotion, no implication, just alignment. It forced the system to acknowledge a gap it had skipped over. The response didn't come quickly. When it did, it answered the question, but opened two more unintentionally. Dates didn't align. Authorization tags didn't match. One decision had been logged under a generalized approval instead of the required category. Individually, these details meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. The system doesn't collapse when it's challenged, it tightens. Processes were rechecked, files were reopened, not aggressively but methodically. Language became careful again. No one accused anyone, no one raised a concern out loud, but attention had returned. The man adjusted. His confidence didn't disappear, it recalibrated. He stopped improvising, he started double-checking. That alone confirmed what I needed to know. Authority doesn't change behavior unless it senses oversight. What made this dangerous wasn't a single mistake. It was the realization that several decisions had been built on the same assumption, that speed was safety. It wasn't. Behind every corrected email was an unasked question. Behind every delayed approval was an alignment check that hadn't existed before. The system wasn't turning against anyone. It was protecting itself. And systems protect themselves by tracing responsibility backwards. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to accuse. I didn't need validation. The structure was doing that work for me. What had been overlooked wasn't just one process or one explanation or one decision. It was how many of them depended on each other. And once attention returns to a system, it never stops at the surface. The silence in the room didn't feel accidental. It arrived after the last page was turned, after the final timestamp was checked, after the quiet exchange of looks between people who no longer needed to debate anything. The decision had already formed before it was spoken out loud. The hospital compliance officer closed the folder in front of him, his fingers resting briefly on the cover as if weighing the words he was about to use. He didn't rush, he didn't soften his tone either. "We've completed our internal review," he said, looking forward now. "Every document submitted, every authorization, every access log." No one interrupted him. The attorney seated beside him nodded slightly, confirming the sequence. She had stopped taking notes minutes ago. Everything she needed was already on record. "There are discrepancies," she said next, calm and precise, "and those discrepancies are consistent. I noticed the shift immediately, not just in language, but in posture. The administrator who had once spoken with certainty now sat back, his hands folded together. He didn't lean forward anymore. He didn't speak over anyone. The confidence he had relied on had quietly dissolved under verification. The compliance officer turned to me. "For the record," he asked, "you were not informed of the revisions submitted under your identification." "No," I said. "And you did not provide consent for the updated documentation." "I did not." Two simple answers, no elaboration, no emotion attached. He made a note, then looked toward the others at the table. "Our findings confirm that. Consent was assumed, not obtained, access was restricted without cause, and decisions were made outside of required protocol. There was no reaction, no argument, just acknowledgement." The attorney continued, her voice steady. "This is not a matter of interpretation," she said. "The policies are explicit. The process failed, and responsibility lies with internal management." The word responsibility lingered longer than anything else she said. The administrator cleared his throat, opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. Whatever explanation he might have rehearsed no longer had a place here, not against documents, not against time-stamped records, not against policy language written long before any of us entered the room. They stepped out briefly to finalize the resolution. When they returned, the outcome wasn't framed as discipline or punishment. It was framed as correction, deliberate and final. The hospital would formally acknowledge procedural violations. The internal record would be amended to reflect accurate consent history. My authorization rights would be restored immediately. Future decisions would require third-party review and documented approval, and the administrator would be removed from involvement in the process entirely. No one looked at me when that part was stated. They didn't need to. There was nothing left to contest. The compliance officer slid a printed summary across the table. I didn't reach for it right away. I already knew what it would say. The attorney confirmed that a written confirmation would be sent later that day, finalized and archived. The meeting ended without ceremony. Chairs moved back, folders were gathered, conversations resumed in low, professional tones, careful now, measured. As I stood to leave, no one stopped me. No one asked to speak privately. No one tried to explain themselves. Outside the room, the hallway felt quieter than it had ever had before. Later that afternoon, the confirmation arrived exactly as promised. Clean formatting, neutral language, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement of error and confirmation of correction. I read it once, slowly. Then I closed it. What stayed with me wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't relief either. It was clarity. I understood then how often silence is misread, how easily patience is mistaken for compliance, how systems appear immovable only until someone takes the time to understand how they actually function. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't demanded fairness. I had observed. I had documented. I had waited. And when the moment arrived, the truth didn't need my voice to be loud. It spoke for itself. I walked out of the building without looking back, not because what happened there no longer mattered, but because it no longer had any control over me.